Good morning. Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1230. Aleph Reish Lamed. We finished the paragraph on page 1230. To sum, the Rebbe Rashab has been dissecting in detail anatomy of emotional and cognitive growth, both on a biological level and on a spiritual level, meaning the neshama lekis, how we grow in our avodah. Generally, 3 stages: mutva, murgish, muskel. Mutva he defined as being behavioral, just doing things on a behavioral level, even if there's no feelings involved. Completely committed. He also defined mutva as being our natural emotions, meaning what we're born with. In the case of the neshama, the natural love like a child to a father. The natural love to the source of sustenance, which, as I pointed out, is essentially taken from Tanya chapter 44, where he mentions those 2 connections. The next level, murgish, is where the emotions begin to be felt. That it's not just behavioral, it's not just the natural, beginning to be felt, that you feel some emotion. You see an expression of an emotion. You feel some love, some awe, respect. That itself is connected with the cognitive development of the child and the context of the neshama. The mind is becoming more active, and it's guiding and molding and directing the emotions. Initially, it's only really just awareness. So going back to that natural love, you may be sitting in the presence of your father or your life source and not be aware of it. So the mind makes you aware. So on the minimal level, the mind is simply a guide, a wake-up call, making you aware and cognizant of that which is around you, which in turn awakens that emotion. But the emotion is essentially still a natural emotion. Then we move to deeper levels in murgash, where the mind becomes more powerful and is beginning to initiate and generate emotions. In other words, even if it's not wired within you, you contemplate, let's say, on God's greatness within existence, and you come away with, oh, I want to be part of that. I want to connect. I want to become part of the Creator, who is much far superior to creation. So the hisbonenus, he pointed out, with the hisbonenus, where you contemplate on how all of existence is just a reflection of God, or you contemplate on the very wonder of creation itself and all the worlds, or of a specific level, Eris and Kalim, Atzilus, etc., or on the whole multitude of levels from Seder Shtalsus, from Tzimtzum all the way down to Malchus Asiya. This I'm quoting straight from the pages on 1228, 1229. And how all of that is kula kamei kalachas is nullified. All this evokes emotions. And now we're talking about emotions that are not natural, the natural love of the child to a father or to because God is your sustenance. You're talking about the mind has come to make you aware and appreciate things that are not only wired within you. Okay. And then comes, he says, muskel, that's still chitzenius hamoichin. Then comes primius hamoichin, where you're contemplating not only on the godliness that's not about your sustenance, but about the godliness that is also not related to existence altogether. How Hashem is on his own, so to speak. In the words that he spoke at the bottom, as he writes in the bottom of page 1229. His bones, ba'atzmus Ein Sof, ech Ein Sof kadosh u'muvdal min ha'elamis. How Ein Sof is completely separate, not as God is the great artist that created this art. And you don't want a relationship with the art, you want a relationship with the artist. but God is beyond being an artist, beyond being even a connected to existence. This he calls Primis HaMeichin. And in three ways, he describes in three different ways, how is this different than Chassidus HaMeichin? So Chassidus HaMeichin, first of all, just to go in the order, the Izbananus is in the divine that relates to existence, Beslapshus Be'elamus. And the greatness that you see in that, and the greatness of God in context of the world. In Primis HaMeichin, you're not talking about godliness that relates to existence, it's godliness on its own, what he called the Etzem Eira Leki, the Etzem Ha'inyan Leki, not as it is in relation to existence. The second thing is that the Chassidus HaMeichin focuses on ultimately midas. It's about awakening your emotions to love God. So there's a very, well, you know what, the second thing, let's say, is Levushe Asaga. That will be the third. Levushe Asaga, it's manifest in understanding, not in abstracting, but in explaining it with examples and relating to us. And the third point, it's Moichin HaShayach L'Midas, which means its primary focus is awakening an emotion, that I should feel a strong attraction to godliness. Not just to the godliness that's good for me, as my father or my sustenance, but to godliness itself. Whereas in the Primis HaMeichin, the focus is not on you. The focus is not on a hergish. It's completely being absorbed. In the words that he said, it is that you have become so absorbed in what God is like that the midas are all are elevated. That connection radiates also in the midas. They become sichlim mamash she'ena murgashim klal. So it's not like I feel. You don't even talk about a fiery love now, even though ima yesha love boyer b'yeser, but it's not murgish klal. So you're very passionate, you're very connected, but it's not I am feeling this deep love, but it's rather all absorbed into one higher state. I'm reading the last lines that we learned on page 1230. That this powerful mind, and remember we said mind was not just a powerful intellect, the mind able to envision and experience something beyond your subjective interests. Midas are subjective, and even the subjective midas are now also absorbed by this moichin. The bechin is gili k'may shehein. Shamidas and bechin is ribia erva achayis when bechin is pnimim b'yeser. They're with an intense energy and vitality, and very pnimium. In other words, not external midas, but pnimius, but he calls pnimius halev. They're literally on the level of sichlim. This is why it's called muskal. So even though they're midas, but the midas are, we'll call them cognitive midas, but cognitive here in the sense that they're elevated to that state that's beyond personal interest, or even the meichin as it relates to existence, but you're experiencing the divine, but it's still through the mind, and that is the highest level that he's so far described. And really, actually, this is it. When it comes to mutva murgish muskal, this concludes the discussion that began on page 1222. That's where he began mutva murgish muskal, and on 1225 began how it is in the neshama elikis. So, though I summed it up in brief, but if you break this down in detail, what you have is really a formula that, if this was really spelled out, can be actually applied to every school, to every parent and every educator, of how to look at children and how to see where they are in these stages of development, and in turn respond to that by giving them what you need to give them in that particular stage, and preparing them to truly mature and develop in the fullest sense of the word, which is really about subjectivity and objectivity. The ability to allow, obviously in earlier stages, the subjective emotions, we call them the impulsive, reflexive emotions. But as a person grows, they take control. So though the emotions remain emotions, but they become far more mature. And not just that the mind is imposing itself on the emotions, that you actually develop the emotions grow like a tree, and they become more mature from the most behavioral, reflexive, to more emotional emotions, subjective emotions, to more cognitive, and even more cognitive, till the emotions are part of experiencing something greater than just your self-interest. Because that's really what it comes down to. In Balabatish, in simple terms, are you going to serve yourself and self-interest, which is really the driving force of most people on this earth? Or not that you're going to ignore your emotions, or you're going to allow your emotions to become part of connecting to something greater than yourself. And that really, in a way, captures the whole essence of all avodah. Is it about me or something greater than me? I know I'm simplifying it, but this is all the stages that come to appreciate that to the highest levels. Obviously, in the highest levels, you're talking about an individual whose whole life, he's not unemotional, he's not disconnected from feelings, but he's allowed his feelings, emotions, and everything about his subjective interest to be connected to what God wants. When you think of the Rebbe is a human being with seichel and midas, but to the point where everything was dedicated to bringing God to this world. The mind, obviously, and also the emotions. Now, each of us has to establish where we stand, and obviously this is a constant growth process. Every day should be different and better. That's how we grow. So it's more than just chronological growth. It's a constant process. No matter how old you are, you could be 100 years old and still growing emotionally and intellectually, which is amazing, because most of us think, you know what, who I am has been determined once I was 8 years old or 20 years old or 30 years old, whatever. And that's it. The rest is just playing out a script. That's not the case when you're talking about avodah and a human being who has a soul that has the capacity to constantly develop and look at ourselves. So there's so much that this can be, when you unpack this, there's so much that so many implications and far-reaching ones in every area. I mentioned education, children, but it's also on shalom bayis, in relationships between adults, between parents to children, between siblings, between spouses, between community members. I mean, which area in life does this not come into play? Every machlekes, every disagreement, every form of divisiveness, wherever you have different interests clashing and conflicting, all this is completely relevant to it. So in that sense, though we've learned these topics, we have learned them in volume 2, volume 1, but here it's really coming into a very operative way of understanding the interface between God and existence. So if you define existence as a yesh, which has its own self-interest in mind, and God as being the completely higher reality, and where these two bridge, here you have literally a blueprint of step-by-step journey of how we climb from the subjective newborn baby that only knows about its own needs, all the way to that full-blown adult that can direct it all toward the higher end of things, where our emotions become much more mature, and also they pursue more objective goals, and they're more refined, and ultimately part of what he just called the sichlim, which is the mind going into experiencing a reality beyond our own subjective interests. Okay, so that's somewhat of context. Now, I didn't really do the context with previous parts of the Ayin Beis, because all this is really coming to explain Gan Eden, which in turn was coming to explain Ein, the transformation of very existence, the darkness of existence toward godliness. But I don't want to go there yet, because there's plenty more to learn about this topic, and we're going to come back to all of that and tie it all together. So this is where we're at. So before we continue, this was a summation. If anybody wants to comment, clarify anything, because now he's going to go now further in this discussion of this development. He spoke about mutva murgish muskel. We've reached a very high level here, but there's more to say, which is going to come as he starts talking about how this now impacts on the emotions. So there's plenty more to go. It's around 20 more pages before he gets back to Gan Eden, just for the record. Okay. The floor is yours. Please, anybody want to speak up? Now's a good time. Okay. I did want to learn this piece in Kuntres Avoda, because there he elaborates more on this, the difference between Pnimius HaMeichen and Chitzenius HaMeichen. I'm wondering whether we should learn that right now. I would do that because it's going to help understand it better. You know what? Let's do it. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to post, if anybody wants to follow the text, I'll post it. I'll just make a beginning. I'll just make a, I'll post the pages. I think it'll help us understand. Yeah, it's a good idea. 1 minute. Let me bring down the Kuntres Avoda.
Rabbi, I can repost it from what you posted before if it's the same pages.
It's two. No, it's 2 more pages. That's why.
Oh.
I know. Yeah, I'm going. Let me look a second. I posted. I believe page 6 and 7. Are you able to see it quickly? Yeah, I think I posted 6 and 7, right? Yeah. I'm going to just post 8 and 9 right now. Take me a second. In case you want to follow. You don't want to, it's all right. I'm going to explain it all. 6 and 7 I posted. I'll post 8 and 9. Okay. That's 8. I will post 9. Okay. Good. Now, just a little intro, just for the record, just for information purposes. Kuntres Avoda is one of the several kuntresim. A kuntres means like a pamphlet, basically. The Rebbe Rashab published several kuntresim, which was not really like a mimer. It was more of an essay, if you wish, that he published. In the beginning of it, you'll see that the Kuntres Avoda, he printed Kuntres Avoda, Kuntres Hatfila, Kuntres Umayon, and Kuntres Eitz HaChaim. And there's also Kuntres Chanoich Nar. So there's, I think, 5 kuntresim in the Rebbe Rashab published. One of them is Kuntres Avoda. As the name implies, it was about Avodas Hashem, and he wrote it in the year Tofresh Samachtes and Tofresh Ayin, it looks like. Meaning basically a few years before Ayin Beis, 2 years before Ayin Beis. Tofresh Samachtes corresponds to 1909, 1910. Ayin Beis began 1912. If you look in the beginning, well, if you have the Kuntres, you could see the Friedrich Rebbe has a letter about it, but it's very similar to what we're learning now. Is almost, some of it is almost word for word, but it's more elaborated upon. So like we've done in the past with other Maimarim, sometimes it's good to look at something else. Here's from the Rebbe Rashab himself. It just explains more points and may make things a little clearer. So I felt, why not? Might as well. So we already did look at page 6 and 7, where he talks more about the earlier stages, these bonus le'eres hamidus. I just want to look what I had read already. Yeah. So if you look on page 6, I had read in the previous class where he speaks about And here he compares mutva murgish muskel to nefesh ruach neshama. Remember, nefesh ruach neshama, mutva murgish muskel, ibur unique and moichin are essentially very synonymous. They just in different contexts, and they refer to nihi, chagas, and chabad. With nihi, the lower nefesh, nihi, and an ibur is like behavioral, natural. Chagas, ruach, and yunika would be emotional. Emotions are becoming revealed. And chabad, and moichin, and neshama is the level of muskel, with, of course, the overlap. In Kuntres, very interestingly, he speaks a lot more about the overlap, about the nefesh within ruach, the ruach within neshama, and so on. But it's very similar. Ayin Beis is a little more briefer, and therefore a little more dense. But in Kuntres, he elaborates more. So in page 6, he talks about how the ikar in ruach, which is the equivalent here of murgish, ikar kanisedus hamidas shebelev. I'm just going to jump a few lines for contextual purposes, and then I'm going to read on more detail a few pages at page 7 and 8 and 9. So it's ikar is midas, as we said. Vagam shehu b'hasaga gemura. We're talking about chitzenius hamoichin. Page 6. Even though it's b'hasaga gemura, you're completely understanding the divine. Let's say about esespheres. You're learning about the 10 spheres. You're learning about eris and kalim, energies and containers. You're learning about godliness as he manifests and creates the worlds. All this is the outer dimension of moichin, because it's all focusing how we are understanding it in garments in a very clear and understandable way on our terms. So, for example, when you use and say, let's understand eres v'kelim of the 10 spheres, we'll understand it with the 10 faculties of the human being. That's called levushei hasaga. That's not hafshata. That's not stripping it from the details. It's actually dressing them in garments, which means like examples that we can relate to. So you look at your own faculties and you say, okay, I have the power of vision in my eye. I have the power of hearing in my ear. I have the power of intelligence in my brain, the power of emotions in my heart, etc., etc. So now I can understand how the divine attributes work the same way. Chachmashe Shal Yisbarach goes into the kelim of Chachma. Bina of Hashem goes into keli of Bina. This is called levushei hasaga, chitzenius hamoichin, because you're focusing on how you understand it in a very palpable and concrete and almost empirical way. Obviously, you don't see the spheres empirically, but you do see your faculties. So that's called levushei hasaga. This is moichin shayachim el amidus. What this means is not that the mind is connecting to the emotions. It means that it's relating to this your subjective reality. So you should understand it. So it's moichin shayachim el amidus. You're not just talking about the idea as an idea. You're talking about the idea as you can relate to it. Okay. And this is we learn. So the bittul. These are words that are only in Kuntres Aveda. The bittul, therefore, who are bittul shem b'chinas hamidas, dainu bittul hayesh. Since it's relating to you, so that it does create bittul because you're understanding godliness, but it's godliness on your terms. So it creates bittul hayesh. Lo yah bittul demeichin shalamayla b'chinas bittul hayesh levad. Not the bittul of meichin, which is you being completely absorbed in something greater than you are. This is a bittul hayesh. I'm just seeing what I'm going to read and what not. So that's why I'm looking at whom is going to.
It's interesting. He brings there v'yadai tahayom.
Yeah. And he says, this is the avodah and the mitzvah of a Yadaita Ayin v'shavesa levavecha. Because clearly, it's not just that you should know, but that you should bring it to your heart, which he explains is your midas, that you should actually feel godliness this way. And it also affects your animal soul. So let me add one more thing. I'm not going to read the whole parentheses. I'll just following. What's the mila of this over moichin alone, over primus hamoichin? The mila is, the quality of this is that you can relate to it. If you sit and contemplate, let's say you're middle of davening and you're contemplating, or not davening, whenever, learning Chassidus, and you look at your own body, my own flesh, and you see, a healthy body works in a very particular fashion, iris and kalim. And then you come and say, God, just like like the soul fills the body, God's like the general soul that fills all of existence. So you look around, you say, 1 second, I see trees, I see birds, I hear sounds. Everything is like my body, but it's a large organism, and there's a pulsating divine soul within it. So what's the advantage? You're able to palpably relate to Lakus, where you could say, wow, that's amazing. You see it's experiencing the divine through the eyes, through the lens of existence, and that creates an ava. The mile of it is it's completely understandable. You can relate to it. You have things to hold on to. When we're going to learn Pnimius HaMoichin, you're going to learn not something that you can say, oh, I have an example with it in my own flesh. You're not going to find examples so easily. There are examples for it, but there's going to be a lot more abstract. So the mile of Chitzenius HaMoichin is critical. For example, if children, let's just go back, if children never went through the stages of subjective experiences and they right away grew into mature adults and they can abstract ideas and never have self-interest, it would never become part of them. It's important that in earlier stages we have, he said it explicitly in Ayin Beis, if you remember, on page 1226, he said, this isn't just due to the fact that we don't see higher levels of godliness. The whole point is that God wants us to experience him. And if there's going to be an us, a you, there has to be subjectivity. The goal is to not remain subjective and driven by self-interest. The goal is to direct and harness your self-interest toward godliness. But it has to begin with a self, or else there wouldn't have been a tzimtzum in the first place. In chapter 44 in Tanya, he says something amazing at the end of the chapter. When he says, why then do we need Avas Olam? If you have Ava Rabbah, the gift from above, and you have the natural love to God as a child to a father, and the connection of you to your source of life, why do you need the whole contemplation? Why do we need to struggle and sit and contemplate on godliness and learn Chassidus? He doesn't say learn Chassidus, but he's spoken basically, why do we have to get so exert ourselves in understanding it all? So he says these words. He says, in order to create a fiery torch, medurag dela, meaning if you want to, to ignite the passion into a great burning flame, which means that you feel it with all the passion, there's only one way, is that you need to immerse yourself. And then he says furthermore there, that you also, because that's what God wants, that you should understand him. Not that God should control you and then you're just, okay, I'm your child, I love you. But that you should become part of it. So in other words, the goal is absolutely to enter the world of Midas, Vashavesa levavecha, not just via daita. Then once you've reached that level where you're engaged and you feel this is you, then you climb and you can reach a place of moichin, like we're going to learn, primus hamoichin, where you can become absorbed in something completely beyond you. But if you started with being absorbed beyond you, it would never be you. So we need to have the so-called iris and kalim, the chitzenius hamoichin, that follow the lower levels of mutva and murgish to get to this higher level. So that's a very big part of this, especially when you're looking at Tanya, you see that critical component. Because again, the person could just say, listen, I'm going to follow whatever God wants me to do. Yes, you want me to have a little feeling. I look at my father, I say, I love you. And that's it. I don't have to do anything more. I can go to work and just follow halacha, shulchan aruch. But that's not enough. For us to become godly people, it requires that it permeates and completely imbues our very being, which is our minds and our emotions, in our fullest sense of the word. And as long as you're more passionate about worldly matters than about God, then yes, it could be you're following all the orders and you're following halacha and shulchan aruch, but it's not you're still passionate about something else. You're not passionate about the connection. It would be like saying to your wife, I love you and you do everything, but my passion is elsewhere. That would be the equivalent. So the goal is that it should be you're completely absorbed with it. And that's the stages that he's talking about here. Okay. Now, on page 7 in Kuntres Aveda, he says now like this. Omnam b'chinas neshama. Remember, neshama here is the equivalent of muskel and chabad and moichin. So we have, as I said, we have nehi chagas chabad, you have ibur yunik moichin, you have mutfa murgish muskel, and you have nefesh ruach neshama. Says neshama b'chinas hamoichin k'mashkos nishma shadai tavinam. V'hu ha'asagav is bonus b'chinas pnimis hamoichin. This is now the inner dimension of the mind. The hainu b'chinas hafshata. Remember the word hafshata melavusha asaga. You're now stripping it away from the garments of understanding. Ki'im be'etzem ha'inyan elokei. But you're talking about the very core the divine idea. Kameshu shemeir ha'inyan elokei begili b'moiche. As it radiates this inyan elokei in the revealed in his mind, b'chinas gili eir rav. In a very intense way. So there's a lot of air going on here. And he very much attaches or connects, cleaves, and attaches very much his mind in this air eliki. So you're focusing now on the air eliki itself. Says the Rebbe Rashab, and how the litmus test, like the Evan Abaych and Eisal, here's what's a sign to see that this is indeed the case? That when he's in this state, all his chushe hergish hativim, his natural instincts, his natural senses, all become nullified or suspended, if you wish, like due to the dvekus, the attachment in the Eir Eliki, which radiates in his mind. Remember, I spoke about the two people looking at one of the great wonders, one of the 7 wonders on earth. So one person is like a journalist and is talking about it, so to speak. So he's not his chushe ergosha or someone very excited, and you see the excitement in a very direct way. He feels it. He says, look how excited I am. Or the other person is so absorbed, there's no words. There's no expression. The object and the subject have melted into one. That's how absorbed you become. So that's a sign, he says, that the moichin are really, the moichin, the Eir Eliki has taken over. And you're no longer like another entity feeling it. Even though there's a feeling, but it's basically a non-feeling, meaning it's that feeling that is so much part of you that you don't see it as, and it's not a sensation that you can describe or experience. It's when you feel it so deeply that it's not definable in any type of expressible way. Vasaga Zui says, this comprehension is higher than midas. This the Aveda with the mind that becomes united, and dvekus is even more than united. Dvekus like cleaves, like the difference in achdus could be two things unite, like you can tie 2 ropes together. Dvekus is like 2 flames coming together. They become like one. It's deeper than achdus. Yesh by chilukim madreges k'moshes bar b'samuch. So the bittul of this, there are different levels, as we shall explain. So even though there are levels in this state as well of pnimis hamechin, but overall, it's higher than the bittul hayesh. There's a yesh that's bottle. So here you are, and you're standing before something that is greater than you are. So you have a bittul. What they're talking here is deeper than that. That you become so absorbed in it, it's not even like two entities. However, goes the other way. This primis hamechin doesn't remain. Rak ha'oyer mispasher to meir gam belev. So it's not the midas disappeared. It's just that they become nullified as entities of their own. They're not being driven by subjective emotions. They have now, the oyer of the seichel extends and radiates also in the heart. The kasher eir liki meir begili ein b'chinas hagbola li is dafke b'meach. Because when this divine energy that we're talking about now is radiated in a revealing way, it doesn't have any limitation to say that it should only remain in the mind, v'lei belev, and should not go to the heart. It doesn't get concealed in the narrowness of the throat. Chassidus explains, just like physically we have a narrow throat, this is the reason why you can understand something, but your heart doesn't feel it. In this case, he's saying it's not being limited by that narrow channel. L'chein meir gam belev. That's why it also radiates in the heart. So in other words, the divine experience here is traveling all the way into the heart, into the emotions of the heart as well. Excuse me. The gam hala, you see how this is elaborating. The top of page 1230 says all this briefly, and here he's elaborating more. That's why I wanted to read it. So he says like this: the gam halev mispol bezeh b'derech memela. Remember the words b'derech memela. If you look at line 2, top of 1230, he says the word b'derech memela. Remember, before the expression was that the midas are the primary thing. Your focus is the midas. And the moichin is only there to awaken your emotions. Because how do you get a person excited about God? You show how it relates to you. How it relates, first of all, to your sustenance as your father. Higher level, relates to you. You see godliness play itself out in your life. Levushi asaga, that you like, from my flesh I behold God. B'tselem elikim, how we are created in the divine image. But when you're talking now about primis hamechin, you're talking about God Himself. So here, it's no longer about the emotions on their own. The emotions here are memela. They're not. The mind is there to facilitate the emotions. Here, the emotions get elevated, and the mind is the primary focus. And b'derech memela, the emotions also get excited by it or affected by it. So like when you're looking at this beautiful sight that I mentioned, or you're listening to music, or you're reading something and you get so absorbed in it, it's the opposite. The emotions are now being affected automatically by your being so absorbed. You don't have to go work on creating and manufacturing an excitement and love in the heart. It comes naturally, automatically from this higher revelation. So it's exact opposite than the chitzeni. The main thing is to work on, to really feel those emotions. It's real work, kizbananus and so on. Here, the work is to reach that level, but the emotions automatically become part of the process. And even though we use the word ispilus as an excitement, he says the emotions also are in a form of dvekus. Dvekus is always quieter than hispilus. Hispilus means you get excited about something. Dveikus is that you're completely connected, but it's quieter, doesn't make the same amount of noise. We're going to learn this a little later, that anywhere there's a rash, excitement on one hand, yes, it's the fireworks are more powerful in the effect on a human being, but dveikus that's silent is far deeper impact. Like we spoke the other day about the difference between silence and sound. Like when you ask the question, the Zohar asks, the Levim in the Mishkan, in the Mikdash, they served with song, with Shira. They sang, they composed and sang songs. The Kohanim, Avedosam b'chashoy, their Aveda was quiet. They were not supposed to speak. They just served in silence. So which is more powerful? The silence of the Kohen or the sound of the Levi? So initially you'd say the sound. It's louder. It's beautiful. You hear it. But the Zohar says, and Chassidus explains, no. Sound is expression. So yes, on the end of it, you need to reach someone, you need to make sound. They won't hear you. But if you're talking internally, when you're really connected deeply, you don't need to make a sound. The connection is so deep, it doesn't need a sound. And matter of fact, sound would be a distraction and would also be almost like a yurida, a lower level than the experience of the essential sound. Because we're talking about not silence, I'm saying. Because the silence is not silence as in weakness, like quiet because there's nothing to say. It's on the contrary, it's stronger than sound. Okay. Not that much hispilus. Why does it say kol kach? Because to say there's no emotional experience, you can't say it's completely silent. Okay. The gadlus hamidus. And this is the level of gadlus hamechin, mature mind and mature emotions, what he called in Ayin Beis muskel. And in general, this is the tzir kaima, the structure, the defined structure, what's called moichin. So this is not Chabad within Chagas, this is Chagas within Chabad. In other words, it's the midas within moichin, that it's a full picture. Moichin is not just the mind, it also consumes and absorbs and, what's the word I want to use? The emotions are also assimilated within it, are also part of it. They're on the same level like the moichin, the hainu leib b'chinas murgish, meaning not in a way that you sense them and you feel them in a very tangible, loud way, ub'chinas hispilus, an excitable way, ki'im b'chinas achdus v'dveikus, that the midas too are na achdus and dveikus. I mentioned the Mittler Rebbe. The Rebbe, for example, you didn't see, there are times you saw excitement and you saw emotion, but there are times where the Rebbe was completely quiet. And you could look at him, you would not see any emotions. But then, in some way or another, you see that there was even deeper, because it was just so much on that level. Basically, it's no longer emotional reaction that you're looking for. You just see a person who their meichin and midas are all, the midas are on the level of meichin, meaning not that they're composed and the midas are kept tame because the mind is in control. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the whole person is elevated to a higher level of divine experience, that it's just all in that place where it's much more serene, quiet than loud, to put it in other terms. Like the difference between Yom Kippur and Simchas Torah, for example. So Simchas Torah is the gilui. You're revealing, why do we dance on Simchas Torah more than any other time of the year? Because it's coming after Matan Torah of the second tablets, where we gain tshuva, salachti kidvarach Yom Kippur. So why don't you dance on Yom Kippur? Because when you're standing in front of the king, you don't dance. Inside, you're dancing. You can't be happier. But you're standing right in front of the king. There's a certain element of gilu birada, the awe. Simchas Torah comes, and it's an explosion, sukkos, and then Simchas Torah, an explosion of the dance, of the joy that you just experienced in Yom Kippur. So I'm not getting into now which is higher. Obviously, Simchas Torah is the Gili of Yom Kippur, so in a way it's higher, but it's after Yom Kippur. So in other words, not always when you see something that's very loud and excitable means it's a greater level. It could be in a very deep, profound, what we call a moichin de gadlus, is that level where the whole human being, the subjective emotions are not in control. They have now become absorbed into the experience of the divine that the mind has led this neshama to. Okay, the next parentheses. I'll just sum up the parentheses. I'm not going to read it because it's a little dense with the different sources. He essentially connects it to what it says in chapter 39 in Tanya, that this Av is called Ru'usa de Liba. What the Libe Chayfetz Bem is that the heart has come to really desire in a revealed way. But then he says, one second. He's distinguishing between the love that comes through his bananus, the chitzenis hameichin, that's the aval pitam v'das, and the rusa deliba, which is comparing here to more the absorption of the midas in the level of meichin. We don't have to go into in detail. Okay. Does anybody want to ask anything? So the next section, he's going to explain further how we reach this level, and I think it's well worth reading. So v'hinen is boyer, continuing Kuntres Aveda, page 7. Now v'hinen is boyer, it was now it was explained earlier, the Aveda b'chinas pnimis hameichin, this Aveda in the inner dimension of the mind, the hainu is bonus be'etzem ha'inyan eliki, that you're contemplating not on the godliness as we see it through the levushei hasaga, through garments and through things that we relate to, but be'etzem inyan eliki, he b'chinas neshama. We said before, this is the level of neshama, not ruach, which is midas, emotions. Omnom yesh b'zeh chilukim madreges, and yet, nevertheless, this itself has several levels. It's not just one level. The kasher hasoga be'etzem inyan eliki, and he was going to explain how we climb from one level to the next. When this comprehension in the very essence of the divine idea, that come after our understanding of the divine through our garments, as I said before, contemplating on nature or contemplating on a human being, and from that extrapolating and coming to understanding that godliness is that we are an example for godliness. That's levushei hasaga. So he's saying now, when the higher level, pnimis hameichin, comes after chitzenis hameichin, the hainu she'ein b'yecholta litfis ulahasig eze inyan eliki k'moshu be'etzem. Because on the lower level, we're talking about a situation where he's not capable of grasping and understanding a divine thing the way it is on its own. Ki'im kashem mislabes tchila b'levushei hasaga. On the lower level, he needs first to understand it with some type of levushei hasaga. In other words, garments of understanding that make that we are able to think of it like handles. The Hainu explains that the divine energy, the divine idea is manifesting in things that can depict and the so-called paint the picture b'dvarim hamusagim, with concepts that we can understand. In other words, you want to talk about godliness, we need something to picture it for us. And gives an example. If you want to understand Zoh, Zohar Ampin, the emotions, the divine attributes called Zoh, you need to know Be'inyan Hamidus HaMasogas. You contemplate on your own midas, chesed, gvura. We know we have chesed, love, gvura, discipline, the tiferes, compassion. From our compassion, from our love, from our discipline, we come to understand that paints the picture what God's goodness looks like, what God's love looks like. Same thing with b'chinas chochma bina bein yediyah v'asogah. You want to understand chochma bina in higher worlds, you need to understand the yediyah v'asogah, knowledge and understanding in our existence. Ub'chinas mamala kamal kamoy hamanshama hamamalas aguf. In order to understand mamala kalamin, how God fills existence with His divine energy, we need a neshama to think about our soul that fills our body. So in other words, we're talking now the stage where you can't understand the godliness. If someone was to say to you, Zav Atzilus, and you say, what is that? And you have nothing in your life that's comparable, how would you ever understand it? But God blessed us, like He says in Tanya, that our faculties, nishtal shlu mehen, they evolved from the higher spiritual divine attributes. So now you have within you, think about your emotions, and you got a picture of Zoh. Think about your mind, you have a picture of Chachma Bina. So everything in Ishtalshus becomes understood through some imagery that you can define within your life. Neshama Mal Saguf. How about Sevav Kalalman? How do you understand the divine that's beyond structure? So we have something as well. B'chinas Ratzon, via Dia Klolis. When you think about a human desire that we want something, Ratzon is not manifest in any keli. I want something. I want to walk. I want to talk. So Ratzon is an example for Sevav Kalam, the Ratzon Hashem, and Yediyah Klolis, not God's knowledge about a specific level, but the overall controller, the captain, so to speak, Ratzon. So bottom line is, in this parentheses, he's giving examples, Ukahai Gavna. So you have things that on this level, before you get to Etzem Inyan Elaki, the divine itself, we're talking about someone who's not capable of grasping it. So now he has within his life ways, handles in order to appreciate and experience and understand godliness. He finishes the parentheses. And now he says, one second. Right? And this is Ubinyanim. So in addition, Binyanim Hamitzayim Eisai, Bidvarim Hamasagim, that you understand the divine through things that depict or picture or paint that picture. And also Binyanim Hamavayim is Davar HaMusik. Another thing besides finding examples, also things that explain that divine concept. Kumei Mitzias Inyan Hamidus V'Inyan Hayediyah. Okay, I mean, it's a very subtle difference. What he's saying now is that not only do you have something that comparable, but you also have things that explain it. So when you understand, let's say, how midas work in general, you also understand how God's midas work. Okay, midas v'yediyah. Mitzias inyan hayediyah. The actual mitzias of the midas and the meich and the yediyah, not just the chesed is similar to chesed, but how they function. Okay. Shebehem mevin u'masigas inyan alaki. This through these handles, we understand and comprehend the divine inyan. Eichu mahu, how and what godliness is like. Just 1 second, my friends. 1 second. I forgot. 1 second. Okay. Eichu mahu. Ubeprati hayanim shabai. And the specific details within godliness. The EF he's still going back. Liyes asagas dover mebli sheyafarate say leprotim. Because you cannot understand something without dissecting it into details. Shehema mevayim esinyan. These details explain the inyan. So you see how much this Kuntres Aved is helping us understand the few lines we learned in Ayin Beis. He's speaking here why Chitzenis HaMoichin is so vital. Because this is the first stage from growing from a child to an adult where you are really contemplating on the details of godliness through the details of existence. That's essentially what he's speaking about here. The Kol Zeba, the Hezbedim, and all this understanding comes with explanations, the Gam b'mishalim, and also with examples. Shebehem v'al yoda meivin u'masikas ha'inyan hated. With them, and through them, you understand and comprehend well the subject matter. Now he's going to move how we go from Chitzenius HaMeichin to Pnimius HaMeichin. It's a very fascinating piece on how the mind, how you grow in understanding things. So he says now, V'achar kach, once you've got to this point, we have a good understanding of the subject, of how godliness manifests, and you have examples in everything that he just said. Now, afterwards, shelel, now you negate, umafshit, and you strip. All this was dressing up that idea of godliness, was dressed up in garments that we could understand. Literally like teaching a student with examples that are examples in his life. But at some point, you want to get to the subject as it stands higher than the examples, higher than these garments. Basically, I don't want to say that the naked truth of it without garments that we need to understand it. You want to get to the very pure idea. Like when Moshe says to Hashem, now we've become close to each other. I want to see your face. I've seen all your garments. I've seen all your way you manifest. I want to see you. What do you look like behind all these garments? Or as the Alter Rebbe said, Im chalei chafatzti. I want to see you, not your Gan Eden and Elam Haba. I want to see you. I want to connect with you. So now, achar kach shel mafshit. Shel means to negate. Like saying, oh, you think this is God is like your chesed? Not so fast. Yes, your chesed teaches you about God's chesed. But now you're climbing that God is beyond the way we understand chesed. There's more to it than just what we know on our terms. Mafshit means to literally strip. To strip, like to abstract something. Peshet v'levish means to strip or to dress. Either dressing it up or you're stripping it of these levushe hasaga. Umaniach es ha'inyonim shebehem, and he puts aside. One second. Yeah. And he puts aside all these things that he explained. He puts aside all these things we spoke about, that through which he understood the idea. And now he's arrived to the very destination, the thing itself. So all the things that he understood that brought him to this place, how he understands it, through all these different ways, he's now arrived to the thing itself. Which means he's come to the very core of the subject that he's trying to understand. And he strips it, and mafshit means also negates from it any of its gashmius. Because you can come away and say, you know what? I'm big and God's bigger than me. So it's like the story the Frierdiker Rebbe tells in one of his letters, the letter he writes to the Rebbe in Chaim Mushke. So he gives an example of how someone who doesn't know Chassidus, when they say Shavisi Hashem lenegdi samid, so they're standing by the Amud and they're davening, and it says Shavisi Hashem lenegdi samid, that I'm completely nullified before God all the time. So how do you envision that? So he envisions a big, I think he says they're a bear or an animal. I mean, it could be a dinosaur, it can be a whale, a very giant thing, and say, look, me compared to that giant thing, I'm completely nullified. So yes, you can compare your chesed and through that understand God's chesed, but you have to also realize, one second, God is not you. And you see it in a chesed in Gashmius. So now you're being mafshirit with Gashmiusan, not to basically avoiding anthropomorphism, avoiding any type of fitting God into our terms. Hanu ma'atzir hamusik. So you're mafshirit from the image that you understood. Because you could also fall into that trap that now say, okay, so God is like me, but he's a bigger version. He's a greater version of me. Shahare. So now moving to page 8. Shahare zeu inyan aliki she'ena klal be'efim v'tzir kazeh be'etzem amuhus. Comes to understand that this inyan aliki, this divine thing we're talking about, is not at all in a form and a shape in its core essence. So we now move to the next stage. After understanding it all, it's like when we say, Chakim b'loi b'chachmi yediyah. God is wise, but not with knowable wisdom as we know it. You know, God can see, like we can see, but it doesn't see in the same physical way as we see things. So now he's gone to a place where you come to something that you know is, on one hand, is similar, on the other hand, is beyond. So he says, "Va'achri hayidiyah eikshe b'klal halakus muslul min yonim hamusogim lanu." And after this awareness, this knowledge, how in general godliness negates and is muslul, is unlike the things that we are understood to us. Yitzayir ha'inyan hamusig eikshehu be'alakus. He imagines or he envisions, depicts, how is it in the godly level, not on our level? How is it on a godly level? Here comes a parenthesis. So in other words, if you are educating a student, after describing and saying, okay, you know that just as you have chesed, love, God has love, now comes next chapter or the next semester. And we're going to teach you, tell me how God's love is different than your God, than your love, than our love. And now we're trying to imagine how it is on the godly level. Now, let me stop for a moment if anybody wants to ask anything.
That muscle that you just gave is still Chassidus, though, right? You're not getting the panimis at that point. With that, can you imagine it is on a godly level? Because you're still talking. I mean, it's almost like he's not quite there when he says that. I don't think. Maybe I'm wrong. That's what I'm going to know.
No, we're getting there. No, he's not there completely. He's going to speak about it more. There's another. I want to read another page and a half probably because he's really breaks it down in very many details here. No, we're not there yet, but we're getting closer to it. Look,
I have a question. Sorry, Rabbi. Go ahead.
One second. This itself, as we know, has many levels. And also each of us need to do this in our own unique way. Not everybody can work the same way. Some of us move quicker or slower, and some of us abstract differently. So I would wait because there's more steps here. Yes, there are more steps. He's now going to explain the parentheses that even Chitzenius HaMeichin needs to also focus on God, not just on you. Remember, thinking about how God's chesed is like our chesed doesn't mean you're focusing on your chesed. You're just using your chesed. It's like the muscle helps explain the nimshal, but you're not trying to explain the muscle. You're trying to explain the nimshal, the moral. So you have to, there's always a focus on where you're going, but there comes that point. I mean, what the beautiful part of this is that, one of the points is that what today is an example, tomorrow, what today is the moral, tomorrow you find out is an example. And then the example becomes, you can discard the example because you understand the idea without the example. And then you need a higher level example. So in other words, it's really the process of how you get to a core idea, and not just its symptoms, if you wish, or its expressions. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think you just answered my question. So my question was, and maybe he's going to explain it more further here, but first it said we should strip away or put aside the theorem, the way we painted it out, formed it, shaped it in our mind, I guess, as we relate to it from our own perspective. Then he says Yitzariyu Ha'inyan Hamusag Echshehu Ba'elakus. Basically, now you got to draw something else. So it was a little confusing. First strip away the theorem, and now Mitzayir or something else. But I think you just answered it by saying it. You go to one higher level of abstraction. You're still Mitzayir, but the example is different because you've already understood something, and now you're abstracting further. I think you answered the question. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I did. Okay. And there's, yeah, because the higher you go, you come to realize that lower levels are, one second. Just give me a second. Yeah, in the parentheses now, we're going to learn that, I'll read it inside. Also in the Aved of Chitzenis Hameichin. And again, keep in mind that he said, Yesh b'zeh chilukim madregas. So remember, there's many levels here, all the time. So he says, also in Chitzenis Hameichin, Sarachli is hergezeh shehisaska shaloi. You need to have this feeling that your involvement is not in understanding yourself. Hu be'inyan eliki. You're coming to understand godliness. It's just you're understanding it through the lens of your own being. That's what he wants to focus on now. Hainu shemevin u'masig inyan eliki. He's coming to understand and comprehend the divine idea, the divine level. Not like when you're learning something where you're busy with whatever the seichel is. Let's say you're learning about human love. You could be learning about human love and not focus on the godly dimension of it. You're studying it only to understand the subject and to comprehend it. One second. So he's making a difference between limud and hisbonenus. This is very good. Many times people ask the question, what is hisbonenus? Different than learning. Hisbonenus, contemplation, is not like learning. So he says, in learning, your job is to learn the subject. You're learning Gemara, for example. You're learning a halach in Shabbos, or about Elam Mitzias, a Mitzia, whatever it may be. You're learning the subject matter to understand whatever it is. By his bonus, he says, you need something else coupled, and together with his effort to understand the subject well, that the idea should settle well and should integrate well in his mind in a ba'anocha teva, which means a good resonance or a good appreciation. Yunach is like hanocha, meaning not just like as an idea remains external, but internalized. In addition to that, you need something else in asbanus. There has to be the feeling. Hargosha kreva b'meiche. Interesting expression. Agrosha, a feeling kreva b'meiche. That's gosha zutami. Hargosha kreva b'meiche. Hargosha kreva. A close feeling in his mind. Sheis asuskehu b'inyan eliki. Shehis askusehu b'inyan eliki. That his involvement is dealing with a divine thing. When you're learning a subject matter and you're in the process of learning, the focus is understanding alone. His bonanus, it's in addition to understanding it well, also the effort that you're dealing with a godly matter here. Very interesting distinction. So this is even in chitzenius hameichin. This is even when you're contemplating on the level levushe hasaga, you're using your examples, your own being. Even there, you need to focus on the divine. Why is it not pnimius hameichin? But on that level of contemplation and isbananus, he doesn't have a musig yet at all in the very core divine idea, stripped of this understanding, that understanding it. How it is on its own. What does he have understanding? This individual, even though his focus is also on the godliness of it, but his understanding at this level is only in the levushe, in the garments of understanding, because that's his asaga, his comprehension, and his aveda. That's the level he's at. So yes, it's not like Yediyah just knowing about an idea and divorced of God, meaning not connected, not focusing on the godly. Here he's focusing on the godly, but it's the godly as seen through these garments, not on its own. As we discussed earlier, that's the parentheses on the bottom of page 6 in the Kuntres Aveda, that this is the work, the Aveda Shebelev, the work of the service of the heart, and this is Midas Kol Adam. This is what something everybody's capable of. Umashin is Bar Khan, and what we're explaining here, now the next level, what we're discussing here, is that after you have this comprehension, and the comprehension knows you're talking about godliness, it's not like limud that is not mentioning focusing on godliness. So the first step is by stripping it and by negating. He comes to understand the very core divine level, how and what it is. And it's understood that we're not talking about Yediyas Hashlila that's explained elsewhere. Actually, what I said before was more by saying God is not this, God is not that. He's saying he's not, that's not the intention here. Here it's more about removing the garments so you can understand the godliness without the garment. So what's the difference between Yediyas Hashlila and that? That needs explanation. I need to think about that. But what he's saying here is basically you begin by focusing on the things you understand and you realize and that gives you a sense of what godliness is like. But then you're removing the so-called garment and you're thinking about the godly itself in it. That it's not shlila, as in that God is not that. What I said before was wrong. I said before, that God is wise, but not like us. That God is chesed, but not like our chesed. That's already shlila. What he's saying here is a level lower than that. The level lower is that God is chesed, but not as you see it in your chesed. So it's not that God is not chesed as you see it. It's just removing you and your human understanding of it. That's what it looks like he's saying here.
Can you stop for questions at a certain point?
I'm stopping now. I'm going to stop in general. I don't think I'm going to continue right now. I think we covered a lot. Here's his question. Go ahead.
I'm wondering, it seems like this development of understanding God and godliness within ourselves, how we connect to it, is this process of gaining an understanding through examples and then stripping that away and rising to another level where you get closer to the inyan, the etzem, and then you strip that away again. And the more you strip away, the more you try to get to the etzem of the matter of godliness. So then you start to run out of examples, it seems. In other words, it seems that the logic of this is that at a certain point you run out of words to use to describe godliness. And I'm wondering, how can we understand that if you follow this progression of logic, you start to run out of ways to explain it?
And that's exactly where you want to go. You want experiencing it without explanation. Exactly right. There comes a point where it's no longer, it's an experience. You get so absorbed in it. You mentioned yourself an example. You gave an example with your spouse. There's a point where you can talk about details, and then there's a point where it's not really even expressible. It's just that the connection is so deep that you actually become one. The problem, you can't begin with that. That's the thing, because we are people of structure and expression. But it's like almost coming that the expression has led you to a point of inexpression, in the inexpressible, but you're experiencing it in a real way. Correct?
Very good.
Why
yeah. Thank you for reminding me. He used my own mashal. Thank you, Shikar. Thank you. Yep.
It's like coming from Shema Yisrael to Re'eh, to see. First, you have to hear the story. You have to begin by hearing it, by appreciating it, understanding it. But then there comes a point where you're like seeing it, and then even deeper, you become one with it. And that's ultimately the goal. Look, the whole point of Avodah, of the whole history from the beginning of creation till Mashiach comes, is this. God created a separate entity that has its own way of experiencing things, a separate consciousness with a yesh, with an ego and self-interest and emotions and everything we spoke about. And the goal is what he wants, a dira b'tachtenim. He wants you and I, to move from there to become one. Just like the Torah says, Adam and Eve, man and woman, were one. God separated them to become one again. But it's not just going back again to square one. Now when you become one, it's your independent consciousness has absorbed godliness to the point, like he says in chapter 36 in Tanya, exact words, the pasuk, lo yekonef oid merecha. Your teacher will no longer cover himself with a garment. Your eyes will see your teacher face to face without a garment, without a veil, without veils, basically without the tzimtzumim and the concealments and the parsais and the shrouds and the partitions. But you can't get there. This really is the picture through Avodah, where you're moving from this. The only way you could exist is if you were independent with all these concealments, and you're really coming to transform the very tzimtzum. Well, we said Laila k'yom yoyer, that the night itself becomes light. At some point, everything will be transformed, and there'll be full unity without annihilating. Because if you began too early, we would be overwhelmed and annihilated by the great light of godliness. So you need all these stages, and we're basically retracing the steps from the bottom up, as I always point out. This is how we climb. That's part of the bigger picture here. Yeah.
That was a great synopsis. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to stop here because there's a lot here. One of myself, I process. Any other questions? Anybody wants to weigh in? Eliezer, you're usually much more expressive. What's going on? You reached the level of higher silence? Is he even here?
He is here.
Okay. But you
He's
all
in the
agree. You see how this helps us understand Ayin Beis better, right?
100%.
Because he's going through this Ayin Beis. Even though usually the Rebbe Rashab would refer to this, but it's interesting. It's like literally explaining the whole section we're learning here.
Did he write it after he wrote Ayin Beis?
No, this was written before, for sure before. I mentioned 2 years before, probably, but more than 2, at least 4 or 5 years earlier. No, it's all right. The Rebbe Rashab doesn't always refer even to himself. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. There's no real, I can't find a very definitive rule. Okay.
What prompts a Rebbe to put out Kuntres at a particular time on a particular topic?
The Rebbe Rashab did it very clearly. This was the early years of when the yeshiva he established, Temchet Mimim. He established it in 1897, Lubavitch, and the Kuntresim were helping to guide the students and the teachers in the ways of Chassidus. That was most likely the reason he gave out these different Kuntresim. The other Rabbeim didn't really give out Kuntresim like that. They did a different Kuntresim. But most likely this was like so-called almost like guidebooks for the yeshiva.
How many Kuntresim did the Rebbe Rashab publish or put out, if you know?
I mentioned before, Kuntres
Avodah,
Kuntres Atfila, Kuntres Mayon, Kuntres Chanech Lanar, and Kuntres Eitz HaChaim. Not in that order. Eitz HaChaim, I think, was the first one that was connected to the yeshiva. But the truth is, it's raw Chassidus. It's just not written in not a mimer Chassidus. It's more of a essay, like a publication. Yeah,
Are these published in one integrated source, or you have to somehow find these pamphlets or whatever guests online? Can you get you know what I'm saying, like one volume?
I don't know. I don't think they publish them in one book. They're separate, like this.
Yeah.
They're separate booklets. There's also Kuntresim from the Rebbe, Frierdiker Rebbe. Were they all published in one? I don't think so. Maybe. I don't think so. Okay, let's stop here. I read till the top of the end of the paragraph on page 8 in Kuntres Avodah. We'll stop here, which corresponds to Ayin Beis, page 1229 and 1230.